On a freezing New Year's Eve in 1984, a farmer walking through a windswept field in Sunderland, Ontario, noticed something out of place beneath the brittle grass. He stopped. He looked closer. And then he ran. What he had just discovered would haunt the country for more than 3 decades. She was only 9 years old. She had vanished from her own driveway in broad daylight, on an ordinary autumn afternoon, in a quiet village where nothing was supposed to happen. The police searched. The neighbors searched. Helicopters scanned the cornfields. Her face appeared on every television in the province. And for 3 long months, her parents waited for any sign of their daughter. When her body was finally found, almost 56 kilometers from her home, the case did not end. It only deepened. Because over the next 36 years, this single murder would tear through Canadian law. It would put the wrong man in prison. It would force a royal commission. It would force Canada to confront the limits of justice itself. And then, in a quiet October announcement in 2020, Toronto police walked up to a microphone and said something almost no one expected to hear. They had finally identified the man who killed Christine Jessop. He had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. This is the story of how a single piece of evidence, collected decades ago and tucked away in an evidence locker, finally exposed the real killer, long after he thought he had gotten away with it. The village of Queensville sits inside the town of East Gwillimbury, just north of Toronto, in Ontario's York region. In 1984, it was small, rural, and tight-knit. The kind of place where parents let their children walk home alone from the school bus stop. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other by first name. The kind of place where nothing tragic was supposed to happen. This case is real. Every fact in this video has been documented in news reports, in the official Kaufman Commission inquiry, in Toronto Police Service news conferences, and in court records still publicly available today. None of it is dramatized. None of it is invented. On October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessop stepped off her school bus in Queensville. Her father, Bob, was not home. Her mother, Janet, and her older brother, Kenny, had driven into Toronto that day for an important family visit. Christine had been left to come home and wait. That was the routine. That was the plan. She never made it to dinner. By the next morning, her face was on the news. By the end of the week, her name was known in every household in Ontario. The search for Christine Jessop became one of the largest in the province's history at the time. And when her body was finally recovered 3 months later, the investigation took a turn that would, eventually, become a case study in how things can go terribly wrong. For 36 years, 2 questions hung over this story. Who really killed Christine Jessop? And how could a quiet rural community produce a crime this brutal and yet hide its perpetrator so completely? The answers, when they finally came, did not come from a witness, or a confession, or a piece of physical evidence that anyone had missed. They came from inside her clothing. They came from science that did not even exist when she died. Christine Jessop was 9 years old. According to multiple verified accounts from Toronto police and family interviews, she was described as a child who loved life, her family, her school, and sports. She had an older brother named Kenny, who has spoken publicly about her many times in the decades since. Her father, Bob Jessop, and her mother, Janet Jessop, lived with the children in their rural home in Queensville. Friends and family remembered her as bright and full of energy. The kind of child who had plans for the afternoon. The kind of child who made arrangements with friends to meet at the park. In the news conference held by Toronto Police on October 15, 2020, then Interim Chief James Raymer reminded the public who Christine was as a person, not just as a victim. Christine was described as a girl who loved life, her family, school and sports, he said. Her face was on every television set and in every newspaper. That is an important sentence. Because in the years that followed her death, the world spent so much time arguing about suspects, trials, appeals, and forensic theories, that it sometimes forgot who the case was actually about. A small girl. A real child. A real family. Her parents had ordinary lives. Her father worked for a telecommunications company called Eastern Independent Telecom. That detail, ordinary at the time, would become enormously important much later in the story. The Jessops lived in a house surrounded by farmland. Neighbors dropped by. Family friends came over for visits. The doors were not locked the way they would be in a big city. Children played outside without fear. That was the Queensville of 1984. As you listen to this case, ask yourself, what would you have noticed first? Would you have noticed the friendly neighbor who showed up to help with the search? Would you have noticed the family acquaintance who worked alongside Christine's father? Would you have looked twice at the people closest to the family, or would you have looked outward, far from home, at strangers passing through? Because the truth that took 36 years to surface, is that the man who killed Christine Jessop was not a stranger. He was not a drifter. He was not someone the family would have feared. He was, according to Toronto police and confirmed by his own ex-wife in a CBC News interview, a friend of the Jessop family. He had been in their world. He had been part of their social life. His wife and Christine's father were co-workers. His own children had played with Christine. And on the day she disappeared, he was, according to his ex-wife, close enough to the family that he would later help search for her. That is what makes this case so painful. The killer was not a shadow in the dark. He was someone they trusted. October 3, 1984, was a Wednesday. The morning began like any other in Queensville. Christine got ready for school. Her mother, Janet, and brother, Kenny, prepared to leave for a family visit to Toronto's East Detention Centre, where her father was being held at the time. Christine stayed behind to attend school. According to the Kaufman Commission report and police statements, Christine returned home from school that afternoon on her school bus. The bus dropped her off near her home as it always did. From there, her exact movements are limited to a small number of verified facts. She went into the house. She put down her school things. And then she walked the short distance to a small variety store close to her home. The shopkeeper, the last verified person to see her alive, said Christine came into the store alone, sometime between 3:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. She bought a pack of bubble gum. She left a minute or so later. After that, there is no verified account of where she went. According to police, she had plans to meet a friend at a nearby park that evening. She never arrived. The friend waited. And waited. And then, eventually, went home. When Janet and Kenny returned to Queensville later that day, Christine was not in the house. At first, they assumed she was with a neighbor or at a friend's. The house had no obvious signs of trouble. Nothing seemed disturbed. But as the hours passed and Christine still did not come home, concern turned into fear. By evening, she had been reported missing. What followed was one of the largest searches in York Region's history at the time. Police combed the rural roads. Neighbors formed search lines through fields. Volunteers walked grid patterns through wooded areas. Helicopters scanned overhead. Her photograph went out across every Ontario news outlet. Posters appeared in shop windows. Within days, the entire province knew her name. And in the middle of that search, according to CBC News interviews with Calvin Hoover's ex-wife, Heather Hoover, Calvin Hoover himself, the man who would, 36 years later, be identified as the killer, helped look for her. He was a friend of the family. He was a known face. No one was suspicious of him. No one had any reason to be. For weeks, the search continued. Tip lines were set up. Reports came in from across the province. None of them led anywhere conclusive. Detectives interviewed family, friends, neighbors, teachers, and strangers. Theories developed and collapsed. Then came New Year's Eve. On December 31, 1984, in a farmer's field in Sunderland, Ontario, part of Brock Township in Durham Region, approximately 55 to 56 kilometers east of her home. Depending on the route, Christine's remains were found. The location was rural, isolated, and surrounded by farmland. According to the Kaufman Commission report and Toronto police statements, she had been stabbed to death. Investigators also discovered something else. Something so small that, in 1984, the forensic world had no real way to use it. Something that, in the right hands, decades later, would become the key that opened the entire case. There were semen stains on her underwear. In 1984, that detail was a footnote. In 2020, it would be everything. The investigation into Christine's death was, by every later measure, deeply flawed. That conclusion is not opinion. It is the formal finding of the Kaufman Commission, an Ontario public inquiry whose final report was released in April 1998. In the months after her body was discovered, police narrowed in quickly on someone close to the Jessop home. According to court records and the Innocence Canada timeline, by February 14, 1985, police had become interested in a young man named Paul Morin. He was the Jessops' next-door neighbor. He was quiet. He played the clarinet. He worked at a furniture company. To investigators, he seemed unusual, and that, in 1985, was apparently enough to draw their focus. On April 22, 1985, Morin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His first trial began on January 7, 1986. On February 7, 1986, a jury found him not guilty. By most legal standards, that should have been the end of his ordeal. But the Attorney General of Ontario launched an appeal of the acquittal. On June 5, 1987, the Court of Appeal ordered a new trial. Years passed. The case dragged on. Morin's second trial began on May 28, 1990. This time, the outcome was different. On July 30, 1992, Paul Morin was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. According to the Kaufman Commission, the evidence used to convict him was a mix of unreliable jailhouse informants, contested fiber and hair comparisons, and, most damningly, what the inquiry would later call staggering tunnel vision by both the police and the Crown. In its final report, the Kaufman Commission defined tunnel vision as a single-minded and overly narrow focus on a particular investigative or prosecutorial theory, so as to unreasonably color the evaluation of information received. Commissioner Fred Kaufman concluded that no police officer or Crown Counsel had ever intended to convict an innocent man. They simply could not see past their own theory. The forensic evidence in the case, including the semen sample collected from Christine's underwear in late 1984, sat largely on a shelf for years. DNA profiling, as we know it today, did not exist when Christine died. The first criminal use of DNA fingerprinting in the world happened in the United Kingdom in 1986, the same year as Morin's first trial. The technology was new. It was rare. It was not yet trusted by Canadian courts. And in Christine's case, it was not initially used to identify the killer. It was used, much later, to prove who was not the killer. By February 1993, Morin had been granted bail pending appeal. And then, on January 23, 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal set aside his conviction and entered an acquittal. DNA testing, finally applied to the biological evidence from the case, had excluded him completely. In an interview with CBC News in 1995, Morin himself summed up the moment with a sentence he would repeat for the rest of his life. "The justice system failed me, but science saved me." He had served 18 months in prison for a crime he did not commit. But Christine's killer was still out there. And the police case, technically, had to start over. After Morin's exoneration in 1995, the Christine Jessop case became something almost worse than open. It became a wound the system did not know how to close. There was no obvious suspect to pivot to. There was no fresh witness who had been waiting in the wings. The years of investigation, the trials, the appeals, and the public attention had all centered on the wrong man. When that theory collapsed, the case did not simply reset. It fragmented. According to the Toronto Police News Conference in October 2020, the investigation had, over the decades, generated hundreds of boxes of evidence and files. There were tip sheets, witness statements, lab reports, internal memos, and case notes spanning years. The Globe and Mail later described the investigative archive as sprawling as a family tree. And yet, no one could be charged. For the Jessop family, this was its own kind of prison. Christine's mother, Janet, never publicly spoke much about her daughter's case in the years that followed. Christine's father, Bob, would later say, when reached by CBC News in 2020, that he felt sickened by the news of an identification. Kenny, her older brother, has been the most public family voice in the years since. In interviews with Global News and CBC, he has said that he believed, from very early on, that the killer was someone who knew the family. Someone who knew his father was in jail that day. Someone who knew that he and his mother would be away. His instinct, it turns out, was correct. But there was no way, in 1995, to prove it. The Kaufman Commission was ordered on June 26, 1996, by Ontario's Lieutenant Governor. Its purpose was not to find Christine's killer. Its purpose was to examine how the system had failed Guy Paul Morin. The report, released in April 1998, ran more than 1,000 pages and made 119 recommendations. It was, in many ways, a defining document in Canadian criminal justice. But it could not bring Christine home. And it could not identify who killed her. For the next 2 decades, the case stayed quiet. New investigators inherited the file. Detectives retired. The world moved on. The biological evidence collected in 1984 sat in storage at Ontario's Centre for Forensic Sciences. Across that quiet stretch of time, the killer continued to live a life. He worked. He moved between homes in the Greater Toronto Area. He had problems. He had health issues. And, eventually, he died, long before anyone outside his family had any idea who he was. For the police, the case file stayed quiet. For the Jessops, every year that passed without an answer was another year of silence. And then, one small piece of evidence, collected decades earlier, finally began to speak. What changed the Christine Jessop case was not a new witness. It was not a confession. It was not even a new piece of evidence. The answer had been sitting in a Canadian forensic laboratory since 1984. What changed was the science. By the late 2010s, a new investigative method known as forensic genetic genealogy was reshaping cold cases around the world. The most famous early example was the 2018 identification of the Golden State Killer in California. By comparing crime scene DNA to large public genealogy databases, investigators could build out family trees from distant cousins and, eventually, triangulate down to a single suspect. Toronto police took notice. In 2020, they partnered with Othram Incorporated, a forensic genetic genealogy lab based in the Woodlands, Texas. According to CBC News, Othram's CEO David Middleman explained that, unlike traditional forensic DNA testing, which examines roughly 20 genetic markers, Othram's process can identify hundreds of thousands of markers. That kind of resolution allows investigators to find very distant genetic relatives of an unknown DNA donor. The semen sample collected from Christine's underwear in 1984 was sent to Othram. The lab generated a detailed genetic profile. From that profile, genealogists began the long, careful work of building family trees from public records, historical documents, and consenting database participants. Eventually, those family trees pointed toward a small number of candidates. Then, finally, toward one specific name. That name was Calvin Hoover. At a news conference on October 15, 2020, Toronto Police Superintendent Peter Code carefully explained the process. He stressed something that is often misunderstood in true crime coverage. The genetic genealogy result was not, by itself, a DNA match. It was, in his words, a potential family lineage. It was up to the investigators to take that lineage and follow it down to a real person who had a real connection to Christine. When investigators looked at Calvin Hoover, two important details came into focus. First, his wife at the time had been a co-worker of Christine's father at the telecommunications company where Bob Jessop worked. Second, the Hoover and Jessop families had been social acquaintances. Calvin Hoover was someone the Jessops knew. The next step was confirmation. Hoover had died in 2015. But Ontario Centre for Forensic Sciences happened to have a sample on file that corresponded to him. According to the CBC News report from the news conference, the laboratory compared that known sample to the unknown sample from Christine's underwear. They matched. On October 9, 2020, 6 days before the news conference, the case was effectively solved. Interim Toronto Police Chief James Raymer, standing at the news conference podium, said, "There are no winners in this announcement." But there was, finally, an answer. Hoover had been 28 years old at the time of Christine's murder. He had a dated criminal record, police said, but nothing that had previously connected him to the Jessop case. He had never been questioned as a suspect. He had never appeared on any list of persons of interest. For 36 years, he had not been on the radar at all. Until a sample collected in 1984, in a laboratory technique that did not yet exist, finally named him. When Calvin Hoover's identity was first relayed to Guy Paul Morin's lawyer, James Lockyer told CBC Radio he had been waiting to hear those words for 36 years. Christine's brother, Kenny, told Global News the family was stunned, but happily stunned. Her father, Bob, said he was sickened, but relieved. And inside the broader investigation, one phrase kept echoing. A sentence Morin himself had said in 1995, and would repeat again in 2020. The justice system failed. Science saved. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. There would be no verdict. Because Calvin Hoover, the man Toronto police identified as the person who abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed 9-year-old Christine Jessop, had been dead for 5 years by the time his name became public. According to CBC News and Global News, multiple sources confirmed that Hoover died by suicide in 2015, in Port Hope, Ontario. He was 59 years old at the time of his death. He took his answers with him. In the weeks after the October 15, 2020 news conference, more details about Hoover's life emerged through interviews, public records, and a CBC News investigation. He had worked for years as a cable installer and technician for several telecommunications companies, including the same company where Christine's father, Bob Jessop, worked in 1984. His job required travel across Ontario and, at times, internationally, to cities like Dallas, Washington, and Chicago. He had filed for bankruptcy in 1991. He had pleaded guilty to an impaired driving charge in 1996. He had lived in a series of homes across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, including Oshawa, Pickering, Ajax, North York, and Waterdown. CBC News also reported, citing his ex-wife, that he had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder around 2010 or 2011 and had struggled with alcohol and drug addiction. His ex-wife, Heather Hoover, sat down with CBC News in 2021 for the first extended public interview by anyone close to him. She described being devastated and totally shocked. She said she had never seen any sign in him that would have hinted at what he did. 10 years, he didn't show shit, she told CBC, referring to the years they were married. He didn't show nothing. How does somebody do that? But she also said something important. She said she believed the police findings, because the DNA was the kind of evidence that could not be argued with. That type of DNA don't lie, she said. There's only one way it got there, and that just don't lie. She also expressed regret. She told CBC that she had thought many times that things could have been different if the police had investigated her then-husband sooner. She said it was too bad his punishment wasn't worse. And she said he could have been caught a long time ago. For the Jessop family, the resolution was complicated. There was no courtroom. There was no judge. There was no sentence. There was simply the knowledge of who had done it, and the knowledge that he would never answer for it in person. Police were clear at the news conference that the case, although solved in terms of identification, was not entirely closed. They asked the public for help in filling in the timeline of Calvin Hoover's life between 1984 and 2015. What were his movements on October 3, 1984? Who saw him that afternoon? Who saw him over the weeks that followed? Did he ever say anything, to anyone, that might now look different in hindsight? Those questions remain part of an active investigation. Paul Morin, the man wrongly convicted of Christine's murder, received the news in his own home on the morning of October 15, 2020. 2 officers came to his door. They were brief. They apologized. They told him the real killer had been identified. In a statement issued through his lawyer that same day, Morin said he was relieved for Janet Jessop and her family, who he said had been through a dreadful ordeal for 36 years. He thanked the Toronto police for staying on the case. And he repeated, in his own words, the same conviction he had carried since 1995. He had always believed that DNA would, one day, reveal the real killer. That day, finally, arrived. The Christine Jessop case is not only a story about one little girl and one terrible crime. It is one of the most important criminal cases in Canadian history, and it sits at the center of 2 enormous shifts in modern justice. The first shift is the lesson of wrongful conviction. The Kaufman Commission report, released in 1998, did not bring Christine home. But it changed how Canadian police forces and prosecutors are trained. Its 119 recommendations addressed everything from the use of jailhouse informants to forensic standards to the dangers of tunnel vision. Many of those reforms are still cited in legal education today. Paul Morin spent 18 months in prison for a crime he did not commit. He was 26 years old when he was first arrested. He was 35 when he was finally exonerated. Most of the years of his late 20s and early 30s were defined by a case that should never have touched him. The second shift is the rise of forensic genetic genealogy. When Christine Jessop was murdered in 1984, the technology that eventually identified her killer did not exist. The first criminal use of DNA fingerprinting was still 2 years away. The kind of mass marker sequencing that Othram performs today would have sounded like science fiction. Cold cases that seemed permanently buried, including this one, are now being reopened by laboratories around the world, with care and scientific rigor. Using the same approach that named Calvin Hoover. For the Jessop family, the meaning is more personal. Kenny Jessop has said publicly that he never stopped wondering, every single day, who had taken his sister. Bob Jessop, her father, was sickened by the news but said he had grown afraid he would die before getting an answer. Janet Jessop, her mother, has remained largely private, but was informed of the identification on the day of the news conference. The bigger meaning is simple. Cases do not have to be forgotten. Evidence does not have to be useless just because the technology of its era cannot read it. A small biological sample, collected by careful investigators in 1984 and stored properly for 36 years, did what no detective in the 1980s could have done. It spoke. And it told the truth. There is one more reason this case matters. It is a reminder that the people closest to a victim, the friendly neighbor, the family acquaintance, the man who volunteers to help with the search, are not always who they appear to be. The killer of Christine Jessop was not a stranger. He was not a drifter. He was a man inside her family's circle. That is uncomfortable. But it is the truth. When Toronto police walked up to that podium on October 15, 2020, they did not call it a victory. Then Interim Chief James Raymer specifically said, "There are no winners in this announcement." He was right. Christine Jessop was still gone. Calvin Hoover was already dead. Paul Morin had already lost years of his life. Janet and Bob Jessop had already spent decades in a silence no parent should ever have to carry. And yet, something did change. A name was finally attached to a crime. A family finally had an answer. A piece of evidence, gathered by careful hands in 1984 and protected for 36 years, finally did its job. So here is the question that this case leaves behind. Do you think genetic genealogy should be used in every unsolved murder case, no matter how old it is, even when the suspect may have died long ago, and even when there will never be a trial? Some people believe identification alone is enough. Others believe a case is only solved when someone stands in a courtroom and answers for what they did. There is no easy answer. And the Jessop case lives inside that exact tension. If you have thoughts about Christine, about Calvin Hoover, about Paul Morin, or about how Canada should handle the next 1984 that is still hiding in an evidence locker somewhere, leave them in the comments. Real cold case work depends on people who refuse to forget. Because Christine Jessop was 9 years old. She loved her family. She loved her school. She loved sports. She bought a pack of bubble gum on an autumn afternoon and never came home. She deserved better. And after 36 years, she finally got the truth.